I'm going to start. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you're here today for one of the Black History Month programs at the Pasadena Public Library. All of our programs are sponsored by the Friends of the Pasadena Public Library. Today's program is about the African American Firefighters Museum in Los Angeles, presented by Captain Brant Burton. We have a brochure that tells about all of the events. We have two more events that are coming up. Thursday is South Flight by Jasmine Elizabeth Smith. That is about the Tulsa race riots.
Oops. Oh, sorry.
She's frozen again.
Not sure what's happening there, so we'll hope she'll come back in a second. We might just need to introduce Mr. Burton and have him start talking.
I love technology.
I know, huh? Yeah, maybe Christine, if she can rejoin, maybe she can give the sort of introductory things about the upcoming programs. You know, our library's off-the-shelf newsletter. We have a Black History Month brochure, and we have an online calendar of events that you can always check on our website for the other events coming up this month. And I think we'll just introduce Mr. Burton to get started with his presentation from the African American Firefighter Museum. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. I think Christine's back and she's muted. Hi, Christine.
Thank you very much. I seem to be having problems with my Zoom connection, so thank you very much. We're honored to have Captain Brant Burton talking to us today about
Not gonna let her get it out.
Okay, well, I'll take it from here. Thank you very much. And we can go back on the back end and pick up any announcements we need to make. How's that?
That's fine, perfect, because I just want everyone to hear you.
Okay, very good. Because we'll do this intro probably 10 more times, I guess, huh? Well, very good. Thank you very much. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I want to thank the Pasadena Public Library for inviting us here to do this presentation for you. I have to admit my paternal grandparents are from Pasadena. They settled in Pasadena from South Carolina in 1919. And my father is born and raised in Pasadena. He passed away in 2013 at the age of 86. And as I was listening to the presentations, I said, you know, my dad never talked about the Pasadena Library, and I wish I would have asked him, did you ever go to the library? But excuse me, we just never got to those conversations, but I imagine he did. But then again, the more I learn about my dad, he may have been a delinquent running by the library. So, but again, it is an honor to be here. Also on the call with us is Michelle Banks. Michelle is the president of the African American Firefighter Museum, our current president and our founding president. And so we work together at the museum. I'm one of the founding members of the museum. The museum was first opened in 1997, December 13th to be exact. And it was a grand opening. And in the presentation, we'll talk about the opening of the museum and how it's worked. So I have about an hour to give you 130 years of history. And so we're going to try to condense it down. And I do love questions because that's how we learn. And I'm sure there might be something that's said here that may spark a question or a thought. And so we'd ask for you to put in the chat, excuse me, and we'll go back to answering those questions. As far as me, I am a current firefighter. I have another 2 shifts to go before I retire or before I leave the fire station in preparation for retirement. I've been a member of the LA County Fire Department for 37 years. I've been a captain for 27 of those 37 years. And so I'm also the historian of the African American Firefighters Museum here in Los Angeles. And so it's just an honor to be here. And I love talking about this history because it's so fascinating and very passionate. And so we'll get right into it, and we'll take the questions on the back end. So hopefully, as we go through this presentation, please write down your questions or put them in the chat, and we'd love to have a great, healthy Q&A in the aftermath of this. So in order to understand the history of African American firefighters, one must first understand the history of African American people in the United States. Without this understanding, only leads to more confusion. And until the country's really had a real discussion about race, it keeps coming up. So we start with that preface because when you talk about African American firefighters, the question comes up sometimes, well, why just African American firefighters? What's significant about them? Everybody is equal and everybody is working together. Well, today we enjoy that equality. We didn't always enjoy that equality, and we'll show you why. And so let's go look at a few things in history. So in American history, think about these things. Rather than doing a Q&A right here, we'll just throw it out here. So some of us may know about what the 3/5 clause means. It's in the Constitution. Some of us may know what meritorious manumission is. Some of us may heard of the Dred Scott ruling. And so going back, the 3/5 clause was where the Africans that were brought here from Africa to do the labor were listed as 3/5 of a human being for the purposes of counting in the census down the South. And so that was a compromise, actually called 3/5 compromise, and that's still in the Constitution. Meritorious manumission was what was granted, was when your freedom was granted to you for doing something meritorious. For example, if you had a slave master and you made your slave master rich, or you did something that benefited them, saved their life, or you told on another slave that was talking about leaving, you could be granted your freedom for a meritorious act. The Dred Scott ruling was handed down in 1857, where Dred Scott was a slave, and he saved up money to buy his freedom, but he was denied that right to do that. And he went to court, and his court case was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court ruled that a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And so that was what the court handed down. That was the decision that was made. That was written into the record of this person being here, because he wasn't even a citizen yet. The 14th Amendment had not been passed or ratified in the Constitution, but people still hear that and they believe these different things. Who was Jim Crow? Jim Crow was actually a caricature. He wasn't a real person. He was a caricature that depicted Black folks, particularly Black men, in a really negative meaning. And so that Jim Crow caricature took on a negative connotation, and it resembled segregation, slavery, and Blacks in a bad light. Excuse me. KKK, the first domestic terrorism organization in the country, right after after the Civil War ended in 1865, the very next year, the Confederate soldiers and leaders decided they had to do something to maintain their order that they wanted. And so they created the Ku Klux Klan, and they are still around to this day, unfortunately. Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the very first Civil Rights Act put on the book. And you know what it says? The same thing as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says. But it had no teeth, because that's when they started to look at states' rights in the federal government. The Birth of a Nation was a very, very popular film in 1915. It was written by D.W. Griffith, and it went around the country, and it promoted the Klan saving this woman away from these Blacks that were newly freed or just had no right to be even citizens. So it was a very, very negative film that depicted Blacks in a bad way. And the NAACP was very instrumental in getting this film removed from the theaters because of the negative connotation that it had on us. Christine mentioned the Red Summer. Well, the Red Summer of 1919 was the year, and that was the most deadliest of race riots in the country. There were logged over 30 race riots in this country, normally initiated by mobs, violence of whites against Blacks, particularly after the Black men came back from World War I and serving their country so proudly. The people had resented that and didn't think that they should enjoy the same rights and freedoms here that they fought for overseas. And so there were a lot of daily race riots that were sparked by various things. If you just kind of Google race riots or the Red Summer of 1919, you'll be surprised what comes up, and you can read about a lot of these different things. So I feel like this needs to be posted periodically just to refresh people's memories. When you look at this graph, it shows American slavery. We can agree right here that 1619 was the year that it started, when 20 slaves were brought here and they landed at Jamestown, Virginia. And for 246 years, that's generations and generations of people that just believed in and worked under and just understood the way it was slavery, American slavery, chattel slavery. So in 1865, when it was finally over, we look at a period of segregation from 1865 to 1954. That's 89 years. And then from 54, the landmark decision was the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case that started to rule out segregation being the law of the land and work toward an integrated society. Even though it took a while to do that, that started in 54. So we've had generations of slavery and segregation more than we've had generations of freedom. So just kind of put that in perspective of how things work. Excuse me, sorry. So in this presentation, we like to try to go in chronological order by year or by era. We usually, when I do this presentation in person, we usually say you can ask questions anytime, but again, we'll hold questions till the end. I love the questions because I usually have answers, and if I don't, I know where to find them or who to talk to get them. There is no intent to offend anyone here. I think it's important to recognize that we are looking at American history or Blacks in American history. This is all a part of the fabric of this country and what has occurred. And so the historical accounts of what has occurred in the past has nothing to do with anyone present today. Nobody was in control. Nobody was in Congress. Nobody was voting for or against certain things. So I really would like for the audience to just understand that and make this a learning and teachable moment for all of us. And I usually say, let's learn and grow together. So that's what this is. So let's get ready for this. So Sam Haskins was our first Black firefighter hired by Los Angeles in the year between 1888 and 1892. He was born and enslaved in Virginia. He came to Los Angeles in the 1880s, and he was hired as a fireman between those years. The reason why we say between those years, because record keeping was very poorly done in those days. And from 1888, he was listed on a roster as living at a fire station because firefighters used to live at the fire station. We'll talk about that. But 1892 was the official record of him being appointed to be what they call a call man. A call man was like a volunteer that went to the station, and they were the designated authorities or people that were allowed to ride on fire trucks and fire engines and go to fires and respond. So sadly, he was killed on November 19th, 1895, responding to a fire in the East LA area. And so he was the first to fall. In 1896, a year after his death, we see the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that was handed down by the Supreme Court that says separate but equal is now in the law of the land. And that's a whole story there about Howard Plessy versus Ferguson in charge of the railroads. And it was a situation like that. But that landmark Supreme Court case established the boundaries of legal segregation in the country. Here's a picture of Sam. He was a single man, and in some accounts, he was known as the Black Hercules, very strong. And so this picture is the picture that we have of him. And we didn't even know he existed, which is very interesting. In fact, we didn't know he was even a person involved in the fire department until the year 2002, when the LA Times was doing some research. And they came across a newspaper article, and the front page said, "Colored fireman crushed while responding to fire." And the date was November 19th, 1895. So they called our museum and said, "Hey, are you guys aware of this guy, Sam Haskins?" We said, "No." They came to the museum, brought us as much information as they could, listing of the census, listing of the roster of where he was. And so we were like, wow. And then they wrote a nice, huge spread in New York, in LA Times. There's an article. We have this article on full display in the museum. You can read about it, that talk more about Sam. And we were able to give him a full fire department burial in 2004, because when Sam died, he was buried in an unmarked grave in Evergreen Cemetery in Willow Heights. And Evergreen Cemetery was a segregated cemetery in Los Angeles. I know this because my grandparents on my mother's side and my great uncles and aunts are buried in the Black section, along with the first Black policeman, Charles Williams, from 1923. So we were able to give him a great grand burial with fire department personnel, bagpipers, the whole 9 yards. And this headstone was a collaboration between many organizations that came together to support the effort to give Sam his proper burial. So here we go in the year 1897. So we skipped from 95. There was nobody hired in 1896 that was Black. Now 1897, we see George Bright come on the fire department, hired on October 2nd. George Bright is the man on the left. He was also the first Black man to promote in the Los Angeles Fire Department. His promotion occurred on August 1st, 1902. And as a result of his promotion, that is when segregation was started in the Los Angeles Fire Department. Because in those days, remember, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate equal. The fire department was actually integrated from 1895, when Sam was on the job, through George Bright's first years and a few other Black firefighters. But the moment that Bright was in charge, that's when the fire department decided to segregate the Blacks. And they put them in one station called Hose Company number 4 near downtown Los Angeles. And so that's when segregation started. Ed Bowen is the firefighter on the right. Unfortunately, he died in 1919 from a serious accident trying to catch a streetcar. Okay, this picture right here is a very beautiful picture. I love it because this shows George Bright on the right and his driver Harry Brown on the left, riding on what they call the state-of-the-art firefighting equipment in 1904 down Beverly Boulevard. Well, today, can you imagine being on a wagon in a torrential rain and late at night in the cold? That's how firefighting was, pretty rough, you know. And so today we enjoy air conditioning fire trucks with heaters and windows and headsets and some cases stereos, things like that. But this is how they looked. And this picture right here was found on a postcard at a yard sale. We didn't even know that this picture existed till that time. It's such a beautiful picture to see this. So here's a full picture of the first segregated company of Black firefighters, Hose Company 4, circa 1910. You can see up on the gentleman from the second from the right is George Bright, the officer, lieutenant in charge. And these other firemen are the gentlemen that worked with him at Hose Company 4. Hose Company 4 was on actually Loma Drive, which is still there, just south of Beverly Boulevard. Well, the station was converted into a church in the 40s, and then they built Belmont High School in 1924, and we'll talk about that and how it impacted these men. The gentleman here on the right is William Hall, hired in 1909. He promoted to lieutenant in 1916. In the fire department, the second Black man to promote. And then he made captain in 1923. So he was the first Black firefighter to become a captain. And captains are usually in charge of a crew of firefighters or a fire station. The next rank above captain in the fire service is battalion chief, because a group of stations equal a battalion and the chief officer is in charge of those groups. Well, in 1931, Captain Hall took the battalion chief's exam and he passed it, but they sent him a letter, and I wish we had that letter. The letter said, "It's a shame you're not a white man because there's no place nor plan for a colored battalion chief in this department." So he was denied the opportunity to even be on the list to serve as a battalion chief. So he took his pension at the end of that year and he retired. Station number 66 in South LA is named in his honor. Now, this is Hose Company number 2, the second segregated company. If you notice, there is a Mexican-American as the lieutenant. That is Frank Leyva. Now, Frank Leyva was a Mexican-American, and back in those days, Mexican-Americans were listed as white in the census. Therefore, they were allowed to command white men, Latino men, and men of color that were Black. And so they picked Frank to come out of the fire station where he was commanding other whites and command the other half of Black firefighters. Now, why were these two stations separate? Well, up until 1912 in the fire department, are you ready for this? Firefighters worked a schedule where you worked 30 days on and 1 day off, 1 full day off. But they gave you 3 hours during the day to go home and see your family. So that life became hard on families as kids got older and wives complained. The fire department did switch up in 1912 and they created a 2-shift system. But prior to that time, you pretty much lived at the firehouse. And so this was the other segregated company. The gentleman here on the right is Lawrence Washington, hired in 1913, made captain in 1936. And the reason why there's asterisks there, because Los Angeles was rampant full of corruption in the 1930s. A guy named Frank L. Shaw was the mayor, and he was a lot of corruption happened on his watch in the police department and the fire department. So unfortunately, Lawrence Washington and a guy named Guy Bailey were said to have been caught up in the corruption where they paid for their captain's test and they became captains, and another station was opened to for them to command on Central Avenue. We'll talk about that in a second. But the thing about Washington, he was from a very prominent LA family. He was the oldest brother of three. His younger brother, Rocky, was a Los Angeles police officer, and his brother, Rocky, served as the first Black watch commander in the LAPD. And his nephew, Kenny, from his other brother's son, was the star football player here in Los Angeles from UCLA to LA. In fact, it was his nephew, Kenny Washington, that reintegrated the NFL in 1946 when the Rams moved to Los Angeles. And that's a whole nother story we can talk about, but I just want to make that point clear here. 1912, the fire department starts what's called a 2-platoon or 2-shift system. They have a day shift and a night shift. So they combine Host Company 2 and Host Company 4 together. Horses are starting to be replaced by automotive apparatus. In the year 1917, George Bright retires after 20 years of service. 1918, Host Company 4 gets an automotive apparatus, so there's no more horses. But it took 6 years from the time they started implementing automotive apparatus for the Black firefighters to get theirs. Can you imagine? Everyone is rolling up to these fires in an automotive rig, and here you still come on horses, showing up to the scene. Well, it wasn't until 1918 the guys got their rig, and here it is. This is the first automotive rig that the Black firefighters served on Host Company 4, with Captain Hall right there at the helm next to the driver, Bob Brown. Now we move into 1924. What happens in 24? Well, they start to create Belmont High School. And Belmont High School is built across the street from the Host Company 4 where the Black firemen are. But there's a problem. The school district, the city council, the fire commission, and the fire department all agree that there's a situation here that we cannot have Black firefighters in positions of authority in front of white school children. And we definitely can't have Black firemen looking at white girls in gym shorts. So we have to make a decision here. So the decision was to move the Black firemen from Host Company 4, which later became Engine 58, move them from that station to Central Avenue Station 14. So the white firefighters just ordered out. And they loved their station, but they didn't leave on a good note. In fact, they thrashed the kitchen, and the chief had to be called to make them come back and clean it up. So more Blacks were hired to staff the additional equipment. There was a hook and ladder truck at this station. There was a 2-piece engine company, as we call it today. So they had to staff it with more firefighters, so more men were hired. In 1929, the fire department creates what they call the 24-hour shift, the A shift and the B shift. So now there's a 24-hour schedule that we work, and we still work that schedule today. This is a picture taken in 1928 of station number 30, or engine 30 and truck number 11. And this is how the museum still looks to this day. So I love this picture because it shows the men in their dress uniforms on their firefighting apparatus right in the very front. It's a beautiful picture of these men and how they looked just ready to go so valiantly. And this is a picture of the museum today. So let me go back again and show you how it used to look. You can see the sign there, engine 30, LFD truck 11. There was a steeple with the flagpole on it. And then today, pretty much almost the same. In fact, when the station was remodeled and renovated in 1997 for our opening, we had to get the station restored to almost the 1913 look when it opened. Those apparatus doors that you see cannot accommodate a modern day fire truck because back in those days, the fire engines and trucks were much smaller and they can fit in those doors. But as the trucks got bigger, they had to move the front doors to the front of the station and became very flush. And we'll show you some pictures of how that looked. There were other segregated fire departments in the United States, not just Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Atlantic City, Indianapolis, Louisville, Denver, Oakland, San Diego, Omaha, Chicago, Washington, D.C., St. Paul, and Minneapolis, and Columbus. And the reason why there's asterisks next to Chicago is because Chicago's had Black firefighters since 1873. In fact, there is a company, Engine 21, in 1878, they invented the fire pole that we all slide down today worldwide. It's a pretty tall task, but I went to Chicago, talked to the firefighters there, and that is in the museum, and it's documented that they started it and they created it. So the asterisk is also there because the whole south side of Chicago had Black firefighters. They just didn't have any Black officers. Most of these stations most of these departments had one station that was segregated. Here in Los Angeles, we at least had two, and we had our own officers. In 1936, because Station 30 was overcrowded, every time they hired a black person, they just put them in Station 30. It became so crowded that they opened another fire station further south on Central Avenue at 34th and Central, Station 14. Why Central Avenue? Well, in those days, Central Avenue was the main thoroughfare for Black LA. During the Great Migration that occurred between 1910 and the World War II era, when Blacks were leaving the South and the East and the Midwest to come west, they settled along the Central Avenue corridor because that's where restrictive covenants pretty much allowed us to live. And that's where the city pretty much segregated us. You can live from Main Street east to Alameda, from First Street south to Vernon, and further to Slauson where the tracks were. That was the pocket of Black LA known as the East Side. So more men were hired to staff Station 14. Our historian, Arnett Hartsfield, joins the LA Fire Department in 1940, and he was trained at Station 30. Why is that significant? Well, in the old days, when there were enough firefighters that were hired, they would all put them together and send them to firefighter school or the recruit academy. In 1940, the new fire chief, John Alderson, decided to make firefighter training like the stations and had them trained on a 24-hour shift basis. Well, in 1940, Arnett Hartsfield was the only colored rookie hired. So the decision was made to let him take his training with the firefighters in the daytime, and then take his go to Station 30 and sleep with them at night, and then come back and take his training again. So when the chiefs called Station 30 to tell the captain of this new arrangement, the captain of Station 30 said, "You know what, Chief, don't humiliate this man. Just send him to us. We'll train him ourselves." And the chief says, "Okay, fine." So when Hartsfield showed up to the academy, he was there and so proud, and they met him at the gate. And they said, "You must be Hartsfield." He saluted them and said, "Sir, yes, sir." They said, "Okay, you go to Central Avenue." He says, "Well, I'm supposed to be here with the other rookies." They said, "No, you go to Central Avenue." And he said, "Well, where on Central?" And they looked at him like, "You don't know?" And Arnett didn't even know the fire department was segregated when he took the job. So he goes over to 14th and Central, and he shows up, and the captain explains to him how things work. And he felt ashamed, he said, but he learned that he had to overcome that. And so his first 2 hours in the station hadn't touched a hose or ladder or a nozzle, and he's going to his first fire. And that's how he was trained. And his nickname was the Eternal Rookie. So in 1942, after 2 years on the job, he is recalled to World War II because he was also a UCLA ROTC cadet captain. And so those gentlemen in the ROTC, both Black and white, most of them were called upon to serve their country during World War II. And the way the fire department operated was they would let you go to the war, the chief would wish you well, and guarantee your job would be back when you returned if you made it to the war. So when he's having his exit interview with the fire chief, Arnett had the audacity in 1942 to inquire about integration. And he said to the fire chief, as the chief wished him well, he says, "You know, Chief, some of the men on Central Avenue want to work at other fire stations." And the chief just really turned his attitude and just changed. And he said, "Hartsfield, separate but equal is the law of the land. And the fire department is not about to engage in any type of sociological experimentation." So Hartsfield said to himself, "I'll take it up when I get back." So he comes back after World War II. He makes it, uses GI Bill to get his law degree, and we'll talk about that in a second. So now after Hartsfield's time working at Station 30, they kept hiring more Black firefighters. And the training staff says, "Look, you know what? We can't just keep sending all the Black guys to 30s. We got to train them." So they agreed to allow the training to become integrated. But it was interesting. Again, a lot of people didn't even know the fire department was segregated. One gentleman, Wally DeCure, one of the pioneering firefighters of that era, told me he graduated in 1946 from the Fire Department Academy. And one of his white classmates said, "Hey, Wally, congratulations, good job. Hey, maybe we'll work together one day." And Wally said, "Yeah, sure." So as the guy turned around, Wally said to himself, "I can't work with him. I'm going to Central Avenue." So everyone didn't know the fire department had this segregation type of situation. In 1948, they built a new fire station 14 next to the old one. They add more equipment there. So The Blacks are not really satisfied with this arrangement because they still feel they can work in other stations. We call this the life net jump. You may have seen it on television or in movies in the old folklore of the fire department. Yes, they used to carry a life net and people would jump in it. So part of the training was you had to jump into this thing. And so every month, the firefighters in Central would do this life net jump. And this guy is actually jumping off the top of a 4-story building into that net right there. One of my favorite pictures here is engine and truck number 30 in 1951. The reason why it's one of my favorite pictures is because I got a chance to meet and talk with half of these men before they passed away. They're all gone now, but they share with me their stories of what it was like on Central Avenue when they were all segregated, and then what it was like when they got integrated, because a lot of them have different stories about their treatment, what happened with them. So we're up in 1953 now. James L Garcia Jr. was the first Black firefighter hired with LA County Fire Department, where I work, and Van Davis followed him in the next recruit class. There weren't enough Blacks in the county fire department to segregate them, but they did work in isolation, and there were a lot of challenges they experienced. In 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education landmark decision was handed down by the court that overturned the Plessy decision of 1896. And now the country is moving more toward an integrated society. In 1954, a group called the Stentorians is organized, and they force integration in the LFD. A Stentorian is from the Greek herald, means a loud and powerful voice. A stentor has a voice of over 50 men. And so when they organized themselves on Central Avenue to form up to promote integration, they said, we'll be known as the Stentorians with a loud and powerful voice. And so they formed up to fight the department on its segregation policy. In 1955, the fire chief is ordered to integrate the Blacks into the other stations and break up these 2 colored stations. In fact, that was ordered by the mayor, Norris Polson. Well, the fire chief was a Southerner, Alderson. He was a Southerner from Maryland. He didn't believe in integration. And because he didn't believe in it, 98% of the fire department supported him. 2% of the men on the fire department had the courage to say, I don't mind, it doesn't bother me. But 98% were against him. The fire department integrated anyway, and the fire chief was fired for not following through with that. But they let him come back and take his pension. Also in 1955, Mr. Hartsfield obtains his law degree from USC, and so he helps lead that effort. Here's a newspaper article out of the California Eagle, an old Black newspaper that was in publication from the turn of the century, last century until the 1960s, showing a young supervisor Kenneth Hahn pinning the badge on James Garcia, the first Black firefighter. Garcia only did 6 years, and he went off into becoming an attorney like his father, and he did some other things. I learned later on that I went to school with his youngest daughter. I didn't know her in school. I saw her picture, but I talked to her older daughter. And she said her father never talked about experience in the fire service. So we don't know any kind of issues that he experienced one way or the other. So we're still trying to work that out. This is Arnett with his cap and gown after he graduated from USC with his law degree. And he used that knowledge from his law degree to help with the integration fight on the side of the firefighters. But it was a collaborative effort between the NAACP, legal defense team, the Black businesses. They all came together and to support promoting integration in the fire department. Now, when the Blacks were finally integrated, this is what happened. This is the crux of the whole idea of why we have a African American Firefighters Museum. It shares the history of our pioneering Black firefighters because these were what the rules that were imposed on them were. Unwritten rules that were imposed on Black firefighters were you were unable to enter the kitchen when the white firefighters were eating. You were unable to drink coffee from the station coffee maker, use the station utensils. You had to bring your own pots and pans from home to cook with. You were ignored for the entire 24-hour period. You stood 4 human spaces away from the others during inspections and lineups. This book right here is called The Old Stentorians. It captures that history written by Billy Mills, who was a councilman, and Arnett Hartsfield together. And it was published in 1974. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but I do have a copy of the book, and a lot of the documentation of their experiences are here. If you look at the front cover of the book, there's a door. That is the kitchen door of Station 46 at Vernon and Normandy in LA. And that sign, White Adults, was placed on the door during lunchtime. And so one of the firefighters thought, we can put this sign on the door to keep the black firefighter out. So the black firefighter at this station was Ray Lopez. And during eating time, he had to stand floor watch on the apparatus floor. So while he was walking back and he looked back at the kitchen to see if those guys were done eating, he noticed that sign. He went to the phone, he called Arnett Hartsfield and said, man, these guys got a sign on the door now. So Hartsfield came over to the station and gave Ray a camera and said, hey man, take a picture of it. Ray takes the picture, gives it back to Hartsfield. Hartsfield takes it straight down to CBS News, to Channel 2 News, and the anchorman, Bill Stout, who some of you may remember from the old days. Bill Stout took that picture, and he's the one that put that white circle around it, and he put it on the 6 o'clock news to say, look what's going on in our LA firehouses with the treatment of Negro firefighters. And so this created a big can of worms for the fire department to expose these unwritten policies and this hostile treatment that the black firefighters were getting. So at the commission meeting the next day, they had the fire chief there and they want to know about this picture. He says, don't worry, I'll get to the bottom of it. He says to a staff member, find out who took the picture. So as a result of that incident and that picture, Ray Lopez was just harassed even more that same evening for taking that picture. And then he was eventually transferred. But as a part of this picture, this was the straw that broke the camel's back for Ray. He went to Arnett, and Arnett would write the letters for these men with his law knowledge, but they had to sign them. And we have in the museum the letter that was written. It was a 4-page letter condensed into one big page, and it lists 12 different issues of protests that Ray was experiencing. Back then, there was no hostile work environment. There was no sexual harassment policy. There wasn't anything like that. There weren't even many black elected officials you can go to. So Ray's letter was entitled Protest of Unfair and Unjust Treatment. That was the title. And so it listed all these things, 12 items, and the 12th issue was that sign on the door. The other conditions, black firefighters were not allowed to watch television with other firefighters. Your visitors were not welcome. In fact, if you had a visitor come to see you or a family member come to see you just to see how you're doing, the captain would see that and immediately call a drill, and your visitor would have to leave. They played vicious jokes on the blacks, like moving their bed next to the pole hole when you're sound asleep. They would place human filth on your pillowcase. In fact, Ernie Roberts is one of our pioneering firefighters, our heroes. Ernie, unfortunately, had the misfortune of being the brunt of a vicious joke, where after one night after a fire, Ernie was cleaning tools downstairs. And meanwhile, upstairs, the white fireman took his pillowcase and the pillowcase of Charles Sanders, his co-buddy, and they went into the bathroom and used their pillowcases as toilet paper and put it back on their pillow and turned the lights off in the dorm. So when Ernie and Charles came back to the dorm to go to sleep, Charles knew something was wrong because of the smell. He left. But Ernie didn't even realize he was so tired from being harassed all day, he laid his head in that human filth. And when he went to complain to the captain about it, the captain didn't want to believe him. And Ernie had a nervous breakdown right there in the station. They took him home in an ambulance, and his hair turned white in 60 days. And that was 1955. But Ernie came back and worked all up until the year 1982, and he left with a smile. And his son Winston became a firefighter as well. We got a chance to interview Ernie in 1991 prior to him passing. And we asked him, was it worth it? He says, without hesitation, yes, it was. When we said, why? He said, well, you have to understand there was no person we can turn to, nobody to kind of come and protect us. We had to keep these jobs to support our families. So they weren't going to run us off this job. So we had to hang in there no matter what they did to us. And so to hear that resilience was just so powerful that there wasn't dry in the crowd during the interview when he said that. They would burn your personal newspapers, constant name calling and constant abuse. And the whole notion was to make you feel so uncomfortable and know that you're not welcome, that you would ask to be transferred back to Central Avenue and go back to segregation the way it was. But once the men left Central Avenue, said, we can't go back. We'll do what we have to do. And this was what the Stentorians' creed was, to hang in there. In 1956, 2 blacks were hired after the integration program, but they were wrongfully terminated. Tolbert Young was a firefighter that came on, and he knew that he passed all of his tests, but they fired him. So he got Arnett Hartsfield to represent him at a civil service hearing. So Arnett subpoenaed his training records. And the day of the hearing, the training captain shows up and says, we can't find his records. They threw them away. And so when he said that, Arnett tells Tolbert, hey, we got him. They can't find your records. We got him. Well, the civil service officer said, the next time you fire a man, you better have his training records. Okay, next case. And they upheld the termination. 1957, we see the hiring of a gentleman named Paul Arduna. Paul Arduna was a firefighter in Omaha, Nebraska for 4 years. And he came out here to take the test to be a firefighter in Los Angeles. The way it worked was you took your interview on a Friday, and then you took the written exam on Saturday the next day with everybody else, so you don't have to travel back and forth for another interview. Well, what they did with Paul, they graded Paul so low that no matter what he scored on the written exam, wouldn't be enough to make the list. And they told him that. They said, oh, Mr. Arduna, after you took his interview, there's no need to come back tomorrow and take the written exam, because even if you scored 100, you still wouldn't make the list. He says, well, why not? Oh, you scored a 46 2/3 on your interview. He's like, what? I'm a firefighter already. So when he went to Station 14 to tell the guys about it, they said, you go back down and take that test tomorrow. I'll discourage you. We'll appeal this. And they did, and they were successful. So Paul was hired, but he almost didn't make it. In fact, Paul was very instrumental in a lot of things in the LA Fire Department. The years 1955 to 63 are very turbulent years for the Black firemen. There's so many stories to tell, and we can't tell them all, but we listed a couple of names here. But I'll just drop down to moving the beds out back. What is that about? Well, by the time Station 14 and 30 were fully, all the blacks had left and all the white firefighters that came in, the captain said, we need new beds. We don't want to sleep on these beds these guys slept on. So they called the shops to order new beds. And so the supply maintenance guy came out to take the old beds away. Well, there were two black gentlemen that worked for the shops, and they knew what was going on. And they loaded the beds up with a smile. Hey, no problem, Cap. We'll get you guys some brand new beds. We'll be back in a couple hours. Okay. They loaded all the beds up. They drove to the warehouse. The guys had coffee, had a little snack, and they drove the same beds back to the station and put them back. And the guys didn't even know. Interesting. So in 59, James Garcia leaves the county fire department to pursue a career as an attorney. And the next year, in 1960, the fire department implements the C shift. This is the third shift in the fire department. That means you have to hire a whole third of your firefighting force. And so that eliminated the A shift, B shift, A and B shifts, so they could have more days off. So the verbal harassment starts to slow down, and we ask this question, why? Well, in 1963, Arnett Hartsfield already retired. He was classmates at UCLA with Tom Bradley. Tom Bradley, who we all know was the mayor of LA for so many years. Tom was a classmate of Hartsfield at UCLA. He became a Los Angeles police officer and then eventually a city councilman. So in 63, when he became a councilman, Hartsfield said, hey, Tom, I need you to get an audience with us and the mayor. And so Bradley got Mayor Sam Yorty to come to a gathering of black firefighters so they can air their grievances to the mayor and say, look, this isn't fair what they're doing to us. They're not talking to us, this whole situation. We can't eat with these guys. So as a result of that gathering, Mayor Yorty issued a formal order to the fire department. He said, you will act like a grown-up fire department, you will all eat together. And that created the policy that we now call organized mess, like the military. And the only reason you can be excused from eating with each other is if you had a doctor's note. It was as a result of that meeting that policy was instituted to eliminate this you can't eat with us situation. In 1965, the Watts riots occur, and there's an engine that's commandeered by 4 black firefighters went into some really, really hot areas that white firemen couldn't get into. And a fireman named Frank Harrison received the Medal of Valor for saving the life of a fellow firefighter at this time. The Explorer program opens up in Watts in 1966. Explorer program is like a junior fire cadet program, if you will, program to get youngsters, particularly high school youth, interested in careers in the fire service. So a couple of black firefighters in Watts decided to open up this Explorer program. And Jim Sherman was one of the guys that did that. Here's Jim Sherman in 1961, an innovator, was at Station 18 in the West Adams district, near Adams and Western. So as blacks moved from the east side toward the west side, they occupied this community, and that's why they had Jim in charge of a crew of white firefighters here. This is the Explorer post in Watts that opened in '66, and this is them on a tour of the helicopters at the heliport. So in the '60s, blacks start promoting the rank of captain. Now, in the entire decade of the 60s, only 9 blacks were hired and only 6 passed their probation during this decade. Now, again, remember, in 60, they created a whole shift. And then you have a 10-year period, 9 to 10-year period, of just hiring more people, but only 9 blacks were hired. And we found out in doing research that a lot of blacks were discredited and disqualified on just nonsense. In fact, the fire department has a football team. They used to, and I used to play on the team. It was a combination of LA City, LA County guys. And one of my teammates, Kevin Burgess, I said, "Hey man, how'd you get on the job?" And he said, "Well, it's funny you asked that." He said, "My dad tried to become a firefighter in 1965. I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, he was disqualified in his medical for having a cavity." Can you believe that? They don't do your dental records in the fire department. They don't care if you have any cavities, but that's what he told him. So he just got disqualified, and people didn't know you can appeal those things. So how many other people were going through those kind of appeals and getting disqualified for things such as that? 1968, Jim Sherman promotes to rank of Battalion Chief, because remember in 31, William Hall couldn't even pass the test, or couldn't even become a chief after he passed it. So in 68, after the Watch Riots, this opened up, and Jim Sherman was the first black to make Battalion Chief. Black firefighters in the East Coast started working on establishing a National Black Firefighters Association, because the East Coast guys started noticing that they had friends and family that knew of black firefighters all around the country. So they wanted to organize a national system of an association, and they did that. In 1969, we saw the hiring of Herschel Clady, Ed McFall, and Bill Washington on the LA County Fire Department. And all 3 of these men were very instrumental in the county fire department's history. We'll talk about that in a second. In 1970, ambulance service is now being provided by the LA Fire Department. Prior to that, LAPD managed the ambulance service, and civilians were trained in first aid. And the original ambulances were known as the Brown Bombers. So those of us that are over 55 years old that lived in LA used to see these brown ambulances going down the street. That was transitioned into the LA Fire Department Paramedic Corps. And the reason that's important, because EMS, or Emergency Medical Services, is what we do in the fire service today. We are the first responders as a part of that EMS system, and this is where it comes from. The paramedic program started with the LA City Fire Department, LA County Fire Department, and Inglewood Fire Department on the West Coast. On the East Coast, Miami-Dade Fire Department was instrumental in the paramedic program. So Ed McFall becomes our first black paramedic for LA County Fire. And in 1970, the International Association of Black Professional Firefighters is formed in Hartford, Connecticut. The guys on the East Coast wrote letters to every major fire department asking those fire chiefs if they had any black firefighters, can they put them in touch with them to form this? Well, you can imagine how that might have went over with some guys. Some guys were said, "No problem, here's so-and-so." Other places, very reluctant, and there are a lot of stories behind that. Here's a picture of one of the last Brown Bombers, one of the ambulances in Hollywood. And this is a picture of the central receiving hospital called Georgia Street Police Station. And it's usually featured in Dragnet. And so this is important again, because mainly in the fire department, that's all we do now is pretty much EMS. In 1972, Jim Sherman retired, and he became the fire chief of the Pasadena Fire Department. And when he sold it to Pasadena Fire, they had a big department lineup, and all the men got a chance to meet the chief and shake his hand. And there was one white guy that refused to shake his hand because this guy was just so against a black man being the fire chief, he couldn't even shake the chief's hand. But there was only one guy that did that. Who was Jim Sherman? Gentleman had a degree in chemistry from the University of Kansas. He was a football player at the University of Kansas. One of the founding members of the Statorians, a fire prevention innovator. He created what's called the mobile lab with a guy named Leo Najarian, and that morphed into today what's called the hazardous materials unit that we see in the fire service. And there's several facilities named after him. LA City Station 64, Pasadena Fire Station 36 on Fair Oaks, and Compton Fire Department Training Center, all named after Jim Sherman. Here's a picture of Jim as the fire chief in Pasadena. He was the chief from 1972 to 1981. And the year after he retired, in 81, he unfortunately passed away the next year in 82. But a very, very innovative guy. Here's Jim Sherman next to Monroe Smith, the first 2 black chiefs west of the Mississippi River. 1973 brings about the first 2 black paramedics in the LA Fire Department's history, Ken Smith and Jackie Evans. In 1974, there is a consent decree that is initiated by the Department of Justice on many U.S. fire departments in Los Angeles was included. Why? Because they saw that there were only 45 Blacks on the fire department out of the 3,200 member firefighting force. 45 out of 3,200. And more than half of those 45 were due to retire in the next coming years. So the decree called for 50% minority hiring and 50% white males. So more Blacks were hired during this period. Unfortunately, the fire department finished them off either in their probationary period or even let them graduate from the academy. In 1975, Herschel Clayton becomes the first Black man promoted in the LA County Fire Department, making engineer, then eventually captain, and then he makes captain in 77. In 1978, the LA Fire Department hires its first 3 women paramedics, the first time the LA Fire Department has hired women to work in fire stations. And Calista Johnson Wells becomes our first Black woman paramedic. Also, the term fireman is changed to firefighter, and the term policeman is changed to police officer, and the badges reflect that as such, because now we're starting to see the hiring of more women in both of these professions. This is a picture of the many Black firefighters that were on the steps of Dorsey High School for a big recruitment effort. 4 of these guys are Dorsey alum. And it's interesting, Dorsey High School in Southwest Los Angeles has the most alumni of Black firefighters than any other school in the LA district. And so they did a big recruiting event there. This building is the Statorian Center on Vernon and Normandy. This is old Station 46, that same station that was on the front cover of the Old Stentorian book, where the kitchen had that sign that says white adults. We've been occupying this facility since 1980. It was donated to us by the councilman, and we continue to operate it as our training center and office. These are a couple of the pioneers from back in the day. The gentleman on the bottom left is Ernie Roberts, the one that laid his head in that human field. And so these gentlemen are the ones that integrated the LA Fire Department, just some of the men that integrated. They came out to the Statorian Center for the opening of it back in 1980. So we occupy the Statorian Center. Paul Arduna, the first man to make probation after they integrated, becomes our second Black battalion chief. And now in 1983, LA City Fire and LA County Fire Departments hire their first women firefighters. In 1984, Delisa Davies becomes the first Black woman to complete the drill tower. Bridget Burke was the first, but she was terminated. And I got to mention, Inspector Jimmy Hill becomes the #1 candidate on the captain's list. And Jimmy was one of our sharpest, most upcoming firefighters at the time. And that was the first time a Black man was #1 on the captain's list for the fire department. Our current museum president, Michelle Banks, is hired as the second Black woman paramedic after Calista Wells. She comes on the job in '84. And in 1988, the LA County Fire Department hires Tanya Burns and Ronnie Still Small as our first and second Black women firefighters. In 1989, the Stentorians had, up until this time, been an organization that just pushed for integration and advocacy for Black firefighters, but they started to open up dialogues with the fire chiefs and start to make themselves a stakeholder in the fire service. And so we initiate those talks. And in 1990, allegations are made against the LA County Stentorians for cheating on the entry-level exam only because we were helping so many Blacks in an organized manner pass the test. So they accuse us of you must be cheating, unfortunately. In 1991, the consent decree is challenged and removed, and Paul Arduna retires as an assistant fire chief. At the time of his retirement, he was the highest ranking Black to promote in the fire department. In 1992, we saw the civil unrest, and there were 3 incidents here that occurred between these 3 Black firefighters in their stations. Just 3 that we know about. There were so many others, but these 3 were pretty significant incidents. In 1994, the LA City Human Resources Development Commission holds hearings as a result of allegations of being unfair to women and Black firefighters. So the Stentorians led that fight to address those inequities. And there was a press conference in front of the museum before it became a museum, it was still Old Station 30. And Fire Chief Manning is forced to retire. And the fire department hires Chief Bill Bamatri in 1995 as a result of that. Bamatri comes in, very progressive gentleman, and did more for Black firefighters up until that time than any chief in previous history. In 1996, racial hostility arises, where 2 Black chief officers challenged the status quo of images and things such as that, and it led to some more challenges between Blacks and whites. And in 1997, Old Fire Station number 30 opens as the African American Firefighters Museum with Michelle Banks as our first president. The Old Stentorians are honored. What we did was we contacted all the Old Stentorians, or those men that worked there when they were segregated, and we had them come back to the museum. And we donned them with Kente class sashes, and they rode on antique apparatus to front row seating at the museum's opening. We shut down the boulevard. It was a great event. And Chief Pamatri issued a formal apology to these men for having to endure that bitter integration battle that was under the rules. This is Michelle Banks speaking at the City Council chambers when they honored Mr. Hartsfield to her right. You can see him wearing his Kente cloth sash as all the other firefighters around him that retired. They made Mr. Hartsfield fire chief for the day. Chief Millage Peaks, the second Black fire chief, did that. And so we're speaking and giving a testimony to his honor as Councilwoman Jan Perry and Councilman Bernard Parks looks on. The gentleman next, right to the right of Michelle in the back with the glasses on, that's Ray Lopez. Ray is the oldest living Black firefighter to this day. Ray was also the guy that took that picture that said white adults. And he's the one that endured that hostility at Station 46. This is the day of the museum opening. We had all the chief officers, captains, and firefighters line up for a procession. And we marched in to honor the Black firefighters, the old timers. This is the captains marching in procession. And these are the inspectors marching in procession. And these are the men as we faced the crowd and faced these men, and we held a salute. And while this lady read a poem that was so beautiful, I mean, it was quiet on the street while she read the poem, and hear these firefighters holding salute and respect to these men for what they had to go through. There wasn't dry in the crowd. It was a glorious day when we opened the museum. So that's how we opened it, with these men's procession like this. The gentleman second from the left is Winston Roberts, Ernie Roberts' son. And he was the one that, Ernie was the guy that laid his head in that stuff. And this is his son, Winston, was a fire inspector. Here's a picture of our museum again, how it looks today. It's very beautiful. Again, this building was built in 1913 and is still standing, and it's been renovated at a cost of $1.9 million from a city hydrant maintenance fund. That's where the funds came from. And so that's how we were able to renovate it and the cost to do that. So in 2004, we hosted the International Association of Black Firefighters Convention, and we lost firefighter Jamie Foster, our first Black woman dying in line of duty. And in 2007, Doug Berry becomes our first African American fire chief. Here's a picture of Jamie. We lost her in her first house on probation. And there's a picture of Doug Berry in the middle with Chris Larson on his right, to our left, who's now a battalion chief. Chris is the first Black woman to become a battalion chief. And on to the chief's left, our right, is Delisa Davies, the first Black woman firefighter who retired as a captain in the fire service. This is the Memorial March as a result of that convention. 300 Black firefighters from around the world are marching down Crenshaw Boulevard all the way to the West Angeles Church for a memorial procession. Today there are over 14,000 paid Black firefighters in the United States. And since 1971, there have been over 80 Black fire chiefs throughout the country. Now that number has risen up to over 100. And three African Americans have served as the United States Fire Administrator, which is the highest ranking position in the fire service. In California alone, we've had Black fire chiefs in all of these cities. Pasadena is listed there with the asterisk, meaning they've had more than one Black fire chief. And even Beverly Hills has had a Black fire chief. Their one and only Black Clarence Martin became fire chief before he retired. Here's a picture of Doug Berry, our first African American chief officer. And Daryl Osby is the first Black fire chief of the LA County Fire Department. He's still our fire chief. And that's Daryl and his father, Bob Osby. His dad has been the fire chief of 4 California cities, starting in San Diego, Inglewood, San Jose, and Oceanside. In the city of LA, 12% of the firefighters are Black, 8 are women. In the county of LA, Blacks make a little under 7%, and now there's 6 women firefighters. We just had a graduation last Tuesday. We graduated Black women, so now that number's up to 6. I got to change that slide. Here are some other notables. We're almost there. 5 men hired after World War II were from the Tuskegee program, meaning they were Tuskegee Airmen that became LA firefighters. 1 man was a Buffalo soldier from World War I, 9th and 10th Cavalry. 1 man became a physician when he left the fire department. 3 men served in the aerospace industry, and 4 have served as fire chief back to back. This is a bust in our courtyard of the museum. This is a bust of Mr. Hartsfield. He's sitting down there next to his wife, Jeannie. And across from him is Artist Lane, a very prominent world famous sculpturist that was commissioned to do that sculpture for him. And we unveiled it on Mr. Hartsfield's 93rd birthday with the board of directors of the museum looking on. So Mr. Hartsfield was hired in 1940, retired in 61, and he was very inspired by the conditions in the fire department to study law. He went to UCLA with Tom Bradley and Jackie Robinson. And in fact, he would always say, if you would have told him back then that he would outlive all these athletes, he wouldn't believe you, but he did. He's known as the griot of Black firefighters, and he passed away on October 31st, 2014. And he received a full Class 1 fire department burial because of how instrumental he was. So he was our historian, and I've had the pleasure and honor and privilege now of serving as historian. I first met Mr. Hartsfield when I was 16 years old. He gave me a one-on-one personal tour and tutoring of this information I just presented to you in his living room, on his living room wall with a slide carousel. And that's where our relationship started when I was a young explorer at the age of 16. So I've always been around this man, and we really thank him for everything. So here's a quote from an icon before we go. Black history calls for an end to the amnesia that has prevented us from understanding the history of this country. An amnesia that has afflicted the United States conscience for decades and centuries. Yes, an end to that historical amnesia. We don't want to forget. That was from Dr. Angela Davis. So we don't want to forget these things. That's why we have to remind ourselves where we come from and what we had to endure to get there. And here's another quote from a hero. To peer into the dark tunnel of history is valueless unless the insight gained is used to light a torch, to illuminate one's path into the future. That was a quote by Vince Julius. Vince Julius was a retired New York fire captain, a member of the Vulcan Society, the first Black fire service organization in the country. Those guys were no joke. They were really some bad dudes. I mean, they dealt with some battles. And so there's a few books that are out. This book, Bound for Freedom, talks about the history of Black LA from the 1800s to the Jim Crow era. And Josh Sai's City Limits is a story about African Americans in LA from the Great Depression to the present day. You have The Great Black Way by R.J. Smith and The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, a very bestseller on the New York Times list. Both of these books are out of print, but I'm so fortunate to have them. LAPD's Black History from 1886 to 1976, and LAFD's Black History, the Old Stentorian book. Firefighter is written by Herman Williams Jr., who was the father of talk show host Montel Williams. Herman Williams was one of the first Black firefighters in Baltimore, and he became the fire chief. And when he unveiled his book, we had his book signing at our museum in 2002. And Black Heroes of Fire tells the story of Chicago's Black firefighters' history. Again, these men were the ones that created the fire portal we all slide down today. FDNY's Black History is a very good read by David Goldberg. It's one of the best books that I've read about the history of Blacks in the fire service, and tells a story about the guys, particularly the Vulcan Society. It's their story, it's a great one. And then The Chief on the right is the story of Wesley Williams, New York City's 4th Black firefighter, but the first Black fire chief officer, a very courageous man. So here's station number 30 in 1929, and here is the museum as it stands today. You can see the compare and contrast there. And so this is where we are. And we are located on 14th Street and Central Avenue in LA. We're open on Sundays from 1 to 4. We actually visit our website or call our office to make an appointment for a visit. And we'd love to have you come by and just see us there. We are still doing tours, but they're by appointment only. So we would just love for you to come by and just see the true essence of our museum with our artifacts and our pictures and our uniforms that are there. And so with that said, that's going to end our presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen. And if there's any questions, we'd love to have the audience ask them.
Thank you very much, Brent, for a fabulous program. The historical detail was absolutely wonderful. You really gave us a wonderful oversight, and I know everyone would like to go to the museum. Okay. I am having internet problems quite a bit. I go in and out.
Yeah. Okay.
Questions.
Maybe Shauna can help out.
Captain Burton. Burton, please put your questions in chat, and he can read them. Everybody can read chat. Everyone can see chat. So if you have any questions, put them in chat, because I don't know when I'm going to go back out, but I just want to thank Captain Burton very much for this excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. It was my honor. So I'm looking for the chat, or is it okay if they unmute themselves and ask a question, or how would you like to do that?
Okay, someone has said, can you read chat? One of them says, what is in the museum?
So the museum
Sounds like everything's in it.
It's interesting. We have an old antique hose wagon from the 1890s and a hose cart from before that time to talk about how firefighters fought fire. That's on the first floor. It's a 2-story building. On the second floor is the old dormitory, is now in the gallery. It's the largest room in the museum. There's a gallery that has helmets, badges, pictures. We have a storyboard of the LA County, LA City firefighters. We have uniforms. We have a display of our pioneering African American women firefighters and fire chief officers. And in the back of the museum on the second floor, we have what's called the International Room, where we acknowledge firefighters from outside of LA and their contributions. And so the artifacts themselves are just beautiful. We have the letter of art that Ray Lopez wrote, or that Mr. Harser wrote for Ray Lopez in 1955 on display. We have pictures of, in 1963, if you remember, the images of the water hoses Bull Connor had on the protesters, right? There's a picture of that, but next to it, there's a proclamation that the Vulcan Society from New York City forced their union to write a proclamation discounting those actions by those firefighters. So the New York Firefighter Union wrote a letter to the Birmingham Fire Department, and they sent it to all the other fire departments around the country, how they were displeased and just disgusted with that act. And they said that you should never do this again. You should never do this to protesters that are peaceful. And so that letter is in the museum. Very interesting. So we have it's very fascinating. I guarantee you'll just be in awe. You know, I've been around the museum since the beginning for over 25 years. And every time I walk, I'm like, wow, this is cool stuff.
Sounds like an absolutely fascinating museum. So what do people do? They just call up and make a reservation?
They can call, or our website is www.aaffmuseum.org. I'm not sure. Michelle Banks is on the call, I believe. Michelle, could you tell us what the procedure is nowadays, please?
Yes. You can call for private tours on Tuesday and Thursday, tour size 10 or above. And for Sundays, if you search Eventbrite, you'll find the links for ticketed timed entry through eventbrite.com.
There it is.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, I think everyone is saying thank you for a very, very informative program. It was just fascinating. And I and the Pasadena Public Library is very honored that you agreed to present this program for us. And thank you very, very much.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Yes. So if there aren't any other questions, we're just going to thank Captain Burton very much and look forward to going and touring the museum.
Very good.
Good. Thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Night.